Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
Welcome back. So we're recording on November 7th, 2024, 2 days after the re-election of Donald Trump to office. What does it mean in terms of policy? Well, that's what we'll discuss with my policy gang here. And I'm talking about National Review Dominic Pino and American for Prosperity's Akash Chougule. Welcome back, guys.
Thanks for having me back on.
Thank you.
So I just want to start by asking you whether you were as surprised as I was by the result of this election.
Yeah, I certainly was. I think it was a toss-up. It was a coin flip, et cetera, based on everything we had seen and heard throughout the year. You know, obviously those swing states and things like that can break either way, but I think the overwhelming nature of Trump's victory and the gains that he made in places where he hadn't previously been that competitive really surprised me. So it wasn't just like he won swing states by increasing his margins in places where he was already strong. He not only did that, but gained in inner cities. He was gaining in, again, obviously heavily Latino populations, even in deep blue states, right? He cut the margin in New Jersey down to 5 or 6 points, in Rhode Island, New York, Maryland, states like that he didn't even win. He was, cutting away at Democratic margins and, of course, running up the score in the Electoral College to give him both the Electoral College and popular vote victory. Really took me by surprise as far as the scale of his win.
Dominic, same?
Yeah, I was surprised by the scale of it. I wouldn't say I was surprised by the outcome in the sense that I thought the election was a toss-up going in, and I really wouldn't have been surprised if Harris had won either. I think it was going to be very competitive all along. But the fact that Trump has won not only the Electoral College, but a rather sizable popular vote majority. It's going to be difficult to say exactly how, because California has the most people and takes the longest to count its votes. But it looks like he'll have a popular vote majority somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 or 3 million when everything is all said and done. And that's much bigger than I think most people would have expected. It really diffuses a lot of the concerns over his win in 2016, where he did not win the popular vote, but nonetheless won the Electoral College this time. No one can make a sort of procedural argument against him. He will be the next president, and there's really not anything that people can say against him.
I'm curious. I mean, I wanted us to talk about policy, but I'm just actually curious because in the last few days I've heard and read a lot of takes about whether this is a vote for him or a vote against Harris. And I just think it's always a mix of both. But some people I've heard said that it has nothing to do with VP Harris, that she ran a good campaign. And really it's just a statement about, the country liking Vance. So you'll have the NatCon saying, oh, yeah, it's just they love populism. And then you have people on the left who are disappointed who said it's just like people love fascism. That's what it is. So it's kind of what's your take on all of this?
I don't think that it's entirely separate from policy. I don't think the politics here is entirely separate from policy. I think you're right that it's, of course, a mix of both, of people voting for Trump and against Harris. But we can't ignore the economic policy situation under the current administration, which Harris, of course, is a part of as vice president. And when Democrats in 2022 and 2023 were talking about Bidenomics, they invented this term to describe their economic agenda, and they meant it positively. They meant it as a description of what they were doing, which was subsidizing demand for specific products, such as electric vehicles or college education. It also meant subsidizing aggregate demand in the economy with very large budget deficits. It meant running the economy hot with a very tight labor market under the theory that this would most help low-income workers. And it meant large-scale industrial policy through things such as the CHIPS Act, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Law, and the American Rescue Plan Act, things that were specifically designed to boost manufacturing and spending on government infrastructure projects. And this was supposed to be their economic agenda. They very clearly laid it out. They very clearly executed it. We have had all of those things happen, and voters didn't like it. And at the start of this year, groups like AFP, where Akash is, started using Bidenomics as a negative to attack the administration, and the administration stopped using Bidenomics as a term in general. Now, they switched candidates midway through, of course, and went with Harris. When you switched candidates, they had an opportunity to change their economic policy. Harris could have said, here's what we're going to do differently. She didn't. She basically just ran on Bidenomics, but bigger. And of voters who said that the economy was the most important issue, which was roughly a third of the electorate in the exit polls, Harris lost those voters by 61 points. And so I think this is a repudiation of a lot of those big government policies, a lot of this run the economy hot mindset from voters, because it caused inflation. They didn't feel like it was benefiting them. And they were willing to overlook a lot of the things that they might not have liked about Donald Trump because of those concerns.
Yeah, I think Dominic makes a good point that they're not totally divorced, but it's not a perfect overlap, right? So you have the economic policy consequences of the consequences of this current administration's economic policies, which have made the lives of the American people harder, particularly the middle class and the working class. And I think that was the primary sort of like real world immediate concern people were facing. And Harris was obviously to blame for that, not only because she's part of this administration, but she cast a deciding vote for two of those major spending bills in the Senate, the American Rescue Plan Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And then I think kind of beyond that, you have this broader vibe of sort of anti-elitism in the American people and the institutional Democratic Party and this institutional progressive movement having this elitist feeling that people just feel like they're being looked down upon. They feel like, insert your pejorative adjective here, that Democrats think you are a racist, sexist, homophobe, whatever, for holding any number of kind of seemingly traditional beliefs or value systems. I think that context, coupled with their economic policies making their lives more difficult, has made the Democrats very, very unpopular. And then I think as it pertains to President Trump, I think perhaps on that sort of vibes piece of it, it's a little bit that they like that he sort of, sticks it in the eye of the progressives, the manner in which he goes about talking about them. But I think, again, on the economy, it wasn't a hypothetical, right? You had a first Trump administration, and obviously prior to the pandemic, you had, a very, very strong economy. You had rising wages, low unemployment. You had, job growth, wage growth, the tax cuts that put more money in people's pockets. And so to the extent people connected those two, I think it was just out of touch elitism on the part of progressives. But I think you can't discount one or the other as far as policy nexus and the vibes that each side was giving off that sort of extended beyond legislating.
So let's talk about what we can expect under a Trump administration. Obviously, the three of us have mixed feelings. And that's true for every administration, right? There's always things. When you come from a free market perspective, there's always things that you're going to like when a Republican is elected, and then stuff that you're going to really dislike. I think kind of President Trump is that on steroids, right? And so let's talk about what we can expect. One of the things I've written about, and I find quite striking actually, is the fact that their plans, the difference between Harris and Trump, at least from what we knew, just sounded just remarkably the same. That these were the plans. So what is it that you actually kind of think is going to be different from the plan? What do you think Trump is going to be really going? Let's talk about the first few months. What's his priority, Dominic?
Well, the things he was been talking about most on the campaign trail are sort of a mixed bag from a free market perspective, right? On the plus side, he's talked a lot about some tax reforms that would be good, reducing the corporate income tax, for example. He's talked a lot about deregulating the economy to make it easier to build things. This has been a major focus of conservatives for a very long time. And if Trump can get in and do something about that, that would be terrific. He's talked about more efficient and effective public services, from cutting government waste and the bureaucracy, and making sure that taxpayers are getting more value for their money. I think those are all things that are very encouraging from a free market perspective that we should be looking forward to, and I hope that he is able to accomplish those things. Now, the two biggest areas in which I think he's not been good from a free market perspective are on trade. He is strongly opposed to free trade and strongly in favor of tariffs. Exactly how that's going to look in practice now is a different question than talking about it on the campaign trail. But there's no doubt that he's against free trade, and he's against allowing Americans to buy whatever they would like from the world market without the government telling them. He doesn't think that that's a good idea. The other area on which he's not been good is just fiscal responsibility in general. The budget deficits under his administration the first time were very large. The Republican Party platform has nothing about reducing the deficit, and the deficits and the spending levels that we have right now under the Biden administration are much, much too high. There is no economic rationale for how high they are right now, given the economic conditions that we have. And it's not really clear how Trump is going to do anything to fundamentally change that trajectory. So I think there are obviously some good things here, along with those two major exceptions. And so it'll be interesting to see who exactly wins out in an actual administration. Because like I said, it's not talk anymore. Now you actually have to do stuff.
Akash?
Yeah, I think I'm cautiously optimistic that it's likelier to be much more good than not good, particularly in the first 100 days. Now, I think if you think about kind of what we just touched on, the reasons that he got elected. So I think right off the bat, obviously they'll do something on border security. The southern border has become an absolute nightmare. People are losing faith in our immigration system in general because of it. And I think not only is there a kind of safety and security component to it, but if we're to do anything constructive on legal immigration going forward, it's going to require faith in the system. And I think something to secure the border, which he'll likely do within the first days, if not hours, of becoming president again, is quite likely. Dominic touched on taxes. Again, this reconciliation package is something Republicans have been preparing for months now. Speaker Johnson, Leader Scalise, and others have been listening to outside voices. There's been work done in Congress and the various committees as far as what all they could include from a tax standpoint, energy policy, federal workforce reforms, things like that. I think there's quite a bit of good that can be done there. I think the regulatory state agencies in general, again, he was very strong last time. I expect more of that as far as deregulating the energy industry and other places, just in general, getting the administrative state out of the way of workers and entrepreneurs. I'm generally pretty optimistic there. I think on the issues that Dominic touched on, again, tariffs and trade is just an issue where, we as free traders just have not seen eye to eye with President Trump. I'll be curious to see how much of it is posturing versus what he actually tries to do. Where are the places that he gets pulled back from on trade? So, for example, what does he do that is specific to China? And then within products from China, industries that are relevant to national security concerns versus all products from China? And then how is China treated differently from the rest of the world? Does he do the universal tariff thing? Is that just kind of a threat mechanism? So I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions on trade. Again, instinctually, I don't think he's where we are, but I do think that given that the incentive that he has coming in to make sure that life becomes affordable again for the American people, he doesn't obviously have an incentive to crash the American economy. I think there will be some quick lessons learned and some political realities and things like that should hopefully temper some of the worst impulses while still allowing the administration to do what they feel is necessary to be tough on China as far as American national security and things like that are concerned.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about immigration. I'm curious what you think, because obviously I'm super pro-immigration. I'm pro-immigration for high skill and low skills. I think that to the extent that illegal immigration is really a problem, it's mostly a problem because we're basically putting underground a lot of people who could really be working in the American economy, and it ends up being the worst of both worlds, where it's just penalizing to people who really shouldn't. It's just not a way to treat people, and it's also it pisses me off because it shows the lack of discipline that Congress has about reforming immigration, which we have known for decades needed to be reformed. But that being said, I mean, a lot has been said by the Trump by Trump himself, but also by some of the people who represented him, from first day starting mass deportation to then he was on a podcast. I mean, during his acceptance speech, he actually talked about the fact that we needed more geniuses and import more people. And he's also talked about recently, apparently on I think it was David Sachs' podcast, about that he wanted to staple a green card to every diploma for immigrants, right? So kind of leaving kind of and we've had the whole nightmare about the eating cats, and which was just really despicable. But leaving all this aside, what do you think is likely to happen? I mean, what is it? Can we sort out what is it you think he wants and what he can do? Because that's the other thing. It's like that's what he wants to do, but then there's what he can do.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of questions here. And I actually think in some instances, he doesn't get enough credit for his instincts on immigration. To your point, Vero, he's made comments frequently in favor of legal immigration. And I think he understands that getting high-skilled, intelligent people from other countries to come here and work here is part of sort of what he would call an America First strategy and American competitiveness, things like that. I think with his business background and things like that, he seems to instinctually see the value and importance of that. But again, where he is, where his base is, where frankly the American people are as far as their concerns over border security and illegal immigration comes first and foremost. I think that will, like I said, be the first thing you see him do. I think you will see deportation of violent criminals. There are tens of thousands of violent criminal illegal immigrants in this country who, as I understand it, are already set to be deported. It's a matter of that process actually unfolding. So how much of that can you do? How fast can that be done? I think these are kind of open questions. Now, I think it's important that some of that stuff, one, is substantively correct and accurate, and he has a political mandate to do, but that it shouldn't be tied up into a general anti-immigration sentiment. I think that's where the distinction between Trump and some of the people that might serve in his administration is very, very important. That to the extent Trump's instincts stay where they have been, where he wants a more kind of a liberalized legal immigration system and wants high-skilled people to come in and wants us to be competitive economically and things like that, that remains the case, and that we're not undermining legal pathways the way some others kind of maybe in his orbit might want to do. I think it's very, very important. I think it's a question, but one where, again, his instincts seem to have been in the right place, and it's important that organizations like ours are kind of holding the administration, the party, Congress, people around him to account for that.
But how is it going to be different from the first term, right? It's not as if they've achieved much. I mean, Dominic.
In a sense, I think the difference in the first term is you have this enormous border crisis coming in that wasn't at nearly this scale originally. I think on the legal immigration side, I think the needs of the economy are constantly evolving, but I think it's hard to know where that conversation will go until we know how things have been dealt with the border security concerns and how the country's reacting to that and how much of his political capital he's spent addressing that issue.
Dominic?
Well, for a complete overhaul of immigration, you need 60 votes in the Senate, and Republicans don't have 60 votes in the Senate, and so they're limited on that front.
Do you think the Democrats wouldn't participate in actually a sound and solid reform of the legal immigration system?
Well, they'd have to figure out whether they believe that Donald Trump is actually a dictator or not first.
Oh, yeah.
I think if they think he's a dictator and that he's a racist and all the rest of this, then I don't think they would work with him. If they move beyond that, once he comes into office and realize, look, we don't like the guy, but he's the president and we can work with him and maybe get some stuff we want, maybe they'll adjust on that. But as it stands right now, I don't think so. And if Democrats are working with Republicans to do something, it's not going to be a sort of a crazy maximalist thing, right? Our constitutional system is designed to encourage and facilitate compromise and meeting in the middle. So if something actually gets passed, that's what it's going to look like. This is also a case where I'm glad that you brought up the victory speech, because that was a major point that Trump said. Look, we want people to come in legally. The very first times that he was talking about this, way back in 2015, he had the big wall and the big beautiful door in it, right? So he's always talked about how very, very strict on illegal immigration, but pragmatic and welcoming of legal immigration. And so this is an area where, and this is going to show up in lots of different areas, but we need to pay attention and differentiate what is Donald Trump saying and what are Donald Trump's fans saying. There are lots of situations where Donald Trump's fans will attribute positions to him that he does not hold. And we see this in many different areas, but it's very much in immigration. There are lots of people in Donald Trump's orbit who are against immigration, period. It does not seem like Donald Trump actually thinks that. And he's the one who's ultimately president and making the decisions. And he does not take very kindly to people who claim to speak on his behalf, but do not actually speak on his behalf. And so that will be I predict a recurring theme of his presidency for the next 4 years, that sort of dichotomy between those two groups of people.
Yeah, I was really kind of happy about some of the shifts on immigration, because really by the end of the first term, the kind of anti-illegal immigration has really shifted. It felt that it had shifted towards an anti-immigrants, and I mean, and again, like that's just deplorable episodes of like the eating cats and stuff. It's just like the way these guys talk about immigrations. Let me ask you kind of a question about Musk. How much does Elon Musk plays in actually the shift on immigration? Because he does kind of, again, in that speech, the acceptance speech, he had this weird, like, oh, he's great. He's great. I mean, it was weird, but he was like Elon Musk. He's like a genius. And so he's an immigrant. How much do you think, do we know anything about Musk's position on immigration?
If I recall, he's kind of said a lot of the same kinds of things, right, that Trump has said, that understands that, obviously, given the companies that he runs, has seen it firsthand, the value of high-skilled immigration and things like that. So I think one of the other places, and Dominic made this point a little bit, is not only the people that are fans of Trump, but the people that come to work for Trump, where they're at on these issues, how much are their beliefs the ones being executed versus the ones of Trump himself on issues like this. So I think there's a number of questions, but again, I also would be very curious to see in this administration how Trump's, not that his instincts evolve, but having the kind of mandate that he just won, enormous popular vote victory, 300 electoral votes, things like that. I wonder that he doesn't feel differently about his own presidency and how he's going to comport himself, if not his personal behavior, then sort of how he governs, compared to the first term, where it was still very much, the country was very divided, and he felt like he represented one half of it, and it was kind of like screw the other half. It doesn't really seem to have that dynamic anymore, given the scale of his victory. I wonder if that also kind of informs the administration's approach to an issue like immigration, which has been so fraught, in past years.
Yeah, I mean, he did win. I mean, there were fewer votes, right? Then, I think he won with like 74 million of votes. I mean, it's great. I mean, I was glad for the electoral system the electoral college system, that he got the popular vote. But I mean, it's still less, right, than people voted in 2020, right?
Yeah, but I think, again, when you look at the scale of the victory, I think the total votes are less of a factor here than the electoral college votes.
That map is super red.
And I think there were also gains in a lot of these minority communities, right? Latino communities, Black community, Asian community. I mean, he won, was it Starr County, Texas, which I believe is the most Latino county in the entire country. Obviously, won Miami-Dade. Even if you go up into the Northeast, where I'm from, I mean, he won places like Fall River, Massachusetts, which is a heavily Latino kind of New England Rust Belt community-esque. And so I think there's a lot of different inputs that could be informing where he's at on a number of issues, at the top of which I would put immigration, as far as how he feels like his electoral victory informed the manner in which he should govern on the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I hope that it's not also lost on everyone that, I mean, high skill immigration is great, but we also need a lot of lower skill immigrants. I mean, I just don't like that dichotomy, but, I rarely get my way. So that's probably another area where what I think won't matter. Let's move to regulation, because I actually think that that's one area where, if successful, could make an enormous positive impact. So what are you guys' thoughts on his ability and his, like, what is he going to be targeting? What does he want to do? And finally, can he do it?
Well, there's always a sort of skills gap between Republicans and Democrats on this issue. And by that, I mean Democrats, when they get in power, are very, very good at adding lots and lots of regulations. And Republicans, when they get in power, generally have a harder time of undoing them. And part of it's because if you're the kind of person who wants to work for a government bureaucracy, you probably kind of like government bureaucracy. And so there's just sort of a selection bias in the sort of people who choose to go into this. But the other reason is that the system is structured in such a way that it's much harder to repeal rules than it is to add them. And one of the things that Trump is going to run into, he was very successful in his first term of reducing regulations. He reduced the regulatory burden, according to estimates from American Action Forum. He reduced the regulatory burden by somewhere around $100 billion during his 4 years in office. Biden increased it by almost $2 trillion. So the disparity here between what Democrats were able to add and what Republicans were able to undo is really, really big. And so it's going to be what would be helpful for the long term is redoing the rules about how to make rules to make it easier to repeal and harder to add new ones. So that's the sort of structural side of it that would be a really important thing to do. And when Trump was talking about a government waste commission to study this issue and make recommendations on it, that is absolutely something that they should be looking into, not simply repealing waste and getting rid of bad rules, although that's absolutely something that they should do as well. Also, but also, looking at how we get these rules in the first place, making it harder to add new ones and making it easier to get rid of old ones.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd add there, Vera, is that when we think of the administrative state and regulations, or when we think of the administrative state, we think of regulations that swamp the private sector economy. We think of agencies acting beyond, the authority vested in them from Congress and making these rules, things like that. I think the other thing that animates Trump and Trump world is this concept of like the deep state that's out to get them and all this kind of weaponization stuff. There actually is some nexus there, and I think the nexus is, one, not only what are these agencies tasked with actually doing by Congress, and are they exceeding that authority, but are the people who work in these agencies acting at the behest of the president? These are executive branch employees, and I think we've gotten to this place where the civil service has become sort of this unaccountable fourth branch of government, kind of like doing whatever they want, or sometimes even impeding the administration in some cases in the last administration. And think that shouldn't be discounted from advocates of limited government. I think we should want an executive branch that serves at the pleasure of the person who leads the executive branch, which is the president of the United States, whether or not you like that person. And I think the other place that starts getting into are some of these federal workforce reforms, right? You're going to see things like what's called Schedule F, which is a federal civil service reform, pulling in, reining back federal workers' unions, things like that. These things seem like they don't really affect the average American, but I actually think they have quite a bit of impact on the extent to which these agencies are serving the interests of the American people rather than serving simply their own interests or the interests of their public sector union or of any particular political party. And I think that's something the president, the executive branch, has a lot of latitude to do simply with executive authority, and then to the extent that Congress can do so as well in a reconciliation bill. I should expect quite a bit there. Again, in addition to the substantive deregulations and things like that the administration did last time, that's a place I'm hopeful to see a lot of progress, as Dominic said, to make kind of structural improvements to the administrative state and its accountability writ large.
Yeah, and Milton Friedman in Free to Choose in 1980, his television program, he was talking about how the counties surrounding Washington, D.C. are some of the wealthiest counties in the United States. And he made the point that, look, this is a metropolitan area that does not have any major productive industries. It is mostly employed with government, with lawyers, with just federal contractors. There's people do not buy things from factories made in Washington, D.C. And so when we have a government situation in our economy where it pays the best to be closest to the capital city, that is a problem. And that's a problem that Milton Friedman was talking about in 1980. It is still a problem today. And so despite all of the talk of how there was this small government revolution in the 80s and 90s and all the rest of this stuff, Washington, D.C. has done perfectly fine for itself. And this is a situation where there is actually a populist, if you want to call it that, argument about elites who are out of touch and who are overpaid relative to the value they actually add to the economy. And honestly, a lot of times the value they take out of the economy through regulation and taxation. And yeah, there's a need for a major structural reform here, but there also has been that need for 40 years now. And so actually getting it across the finish line, actually making a difference on this, we'll see what they can actually do.
Yeah, if I could make one more point here, Vera, Dominic makes a really good point, which is that in the time since his first administration ended, we've had this whole national conservatism debate kind of pop up. And while it's not universally the case among national conservatives, there are a segment who call themselves populists and claim to kind of speak for the working man, who don't want to shrink the administrative state. They are very much in favor of a robust regulatory state, which completely flies in the face of where President Trump is at, flies in the face of why he got elected, and flies in the face of a genuine populist agenda. And I think that's something that he has the opportunity to, not only is he likely to do the deregulatory agenda like he did last time, but I think it's, one, important for people like us to point out that what he's doing is more in line with limited government, free market folks on this issue than some of the national conservatives who claim Trump as their standard bearer. I think that's a point worth making. And then I think the other is this populist argument is one for us to make, and hopefully one that the president himself and his allies in Congress and elsewhere make, which is that it's not just about freeing up big businesses and employers and things like that. And while there is obviously a cost of living impact on the administrative state, and deregulation helps people's pocketbooks, it is also this populist argument that you have all these bureaucrats and insiders and lobbyists who rig the rules in their own favor, and the extent to which we deregulate does in fact drain the swamp, as President Trump has talked about. I think we cannot stop making that point from a populist political standpoint, which, again, just to put a bow on it, is important economically, but even going back to like the vibes that people are feeling about our political landscape and why they voted a certain way and how they feel about our politics. I think this issue fits right there, and it's one that lines up with where we're at as advocates of limited government, and one that we need to be taking advantage of substantively and rhetorically in that sense.
So I'm curious. I mean, Akash, you brought up Schedule F, right? I talked with Stephanie Slade about Project 2025, and that's where the like basically it got a lot of attention from the media, and and trying to portray 2025. I mean, part of it were very disturbing, but for the most part, it was kind of your traditional kind of conservative agenda. But Schedule F was something that got a lot of attention. And when I talked with Stephanie, one of the things she was saying was like this notion that they're going to be firing 50,000 bureaucrats and replacing them with loyalists is it just probably kind of flies in the face of their even ability to do it, even though they may want. But what's your position on leaving aside kind of the rhetoric around it on both sides? What's your do you think is doable? Do you think there's a way that is there any merits to actually to this approach? I mean, it seems that and how what would be a good way to do it rather than kind of thinking about it like they are and like we're going to install loyalists and how should it be done?
Yeah, short answer, yeah, I think there's a lot of merit here. Now, some of this will get into the legal manner in which these executive orders and things are written, and I won't claim to have the expertise there as far as how it needs to be written and the scale that it can accomplish. But I think ultimately, like I said, we should want an executive branch that works for the executive branch and the person who leads it. We don't have that today. What we have is an unaccountable fourth branch of bureaucrats who report to no one. They're not elected by anyone. They have no consequences for undercutting their responsibilities or not doing their job as they're told or putting their own political beliefs ahead of the kind of matter at hand. I don't think that that's good for anyone, regardless of where they're at politically or ideologically. So I think Schedule F is intended to remedy that. Now, again, are there nuances there as far as the kind of people that career civil servants are replaced with, who are political appointees, and what are they trying to accomplish, and who are they serving, and things like that? Absolutely. But I think on the merits and the substance of what that is attempting to do, it is a step in the right direction for our form of representative government compared to where we are today with the administrative state that is completely unaccountable and is, in general, making people's lives more difficult and more expensive.
Is Schedule F, you think, a way to go about it?
I do. I think it's the first kind of concrete proposal that we've seen that would really address this in a substantive manner. It was obviously pulled back, or struck down right before the end of the last administration, and the Biden administration, of course, has no interest in, sort of weeding out a progressive civil service. But I think, again, until we see an alternative, Schedule F would be the boldest, most comprehensive way to ensure that executive branch employees serve at the pleasure of the person who leads the executive branch.
Yeah. Dominic, do you have any thought on this?
Yeah, that's who they work for in our constitutional order. The government starts with we the people. The people elect representatives. We elect the president, and the people who work in the executive branch are ultimately responsible to the president. That's how it's supposed to work. And if they believe that following the president's orders are contrary to their personal beliefs, they should get a different job. Now, there's a separate question, which is what the president asking to do legal? They also have a duty to uphold the law and the Constitution, and so if they're asked to do something illegal by the president, that is a different question. But a lot of the stuff that Trump wants to do is not illegal. It's not unconstitutional. It's just different from the way that we've done things previously. And if the people in positions to execute those decisions do not believe that they should do that, they need to get a different job. That's how it works in the public sector. We have a problem, as Akash mentioned, with government unions, where people are not accountable to the voters. They're accountable to the government unions, and the government unions then work to get politicians elected who are favorable to them. Unionization in the public sector really shouldn't be allowed, quite frankly. And standing up to those unions now, though, that they are firmly entrenched in the system is a big problem. I think one of the best illustrations of this, unfortunately, and it's very sad that this is the case, is in the Department of Veterans Affairs. Obviously, everyone wants our veterans to be taken care of. The government owes it to people who served in the military to take care of them, more than perhaps anybody else. But the budget from the Department of Veterans Affairs since 2000 has increased by between 5 and 6 times. And that's at the same time that the population of veterans has declined by about a quarter, because a lot of the veterans from World War II, which is by far the largest war the United States has ever been a part of, a lot of them have passed away. And so we are in a situation where we have a declining population that is being taken care of with 5 to 6 times more money. Where's a lot of that money going? The workforce has doubled in the Department of Veterans Affairs in that span of time. And
there's no evidence that care is better either.
There's no evidence that care is better. And the American Federation of Government Employees, the union that represents a lot of these people, considers the Veterans Affairs contract to be its best contract in the federal government. And so this is something that we should absolutely be watching out for, and something that President Trump will need to take on if he actually wants to make a difference on this issue.
So let's talk about taxes now, because it's going to be really at the center of all the conversation that we have. And I guess we can roll into this our conversation about the debt, because being, deficit conscious, like kind of trying to be fiscally responsible should be part of any conversation about reforming taxes. So next year, some important provisions of the Trump tax cut of 2017 are going to expire. All the individual taxes, if I'm remembering correctly. What can we expect? So this is where there's going to be really actually also a big difference between what the president wants and what Congress can do, obviously. So what do you think we can expect, or what would you like to see happening on that front?
Yeah, I think they've kicked around reducing the corporate rate further. I think to the extent that that's possible, I think that's a good idea to, again, continue to juice economic growth, investment, job creation, wage growth, and so on. Again, those individual rates, as you mentioned, Vero, expire, and no one wants to see a tax increase on anyone at any income level, particularly given the inflation crisis we've been in. The last thing people need is another massive cost of living increase. Other things that are really of high priority on Capitol Hill, based on the conversations we've had, we've done almost 1,000 meetings this year on this issue on Capitol Hill at AFP, are the 199A, the small business deduction, the R&D, research and development credits, things like that. And so I think there's a lot that can be done there. The highest priority needs to be extending and making permanent the policies from 2017 that were so constructive and pro-growth to begin with. Beyond that, what they end up doing, I think, is kind of an open question. And to your point, what can they afford as far as a deficit impact and things like that will limit that a little bit. But again, I think extending, making permanent the current policies that worked starting in 2017 is the number one priority. And then let's build from there and see what we can do. And I think the real takeaway, again, for people in our movement is really to frame it as a series of trade-offs, right? The extent to which we want it to be paid for, the extent to which people want to do no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, this and that, these different tax carve-out schemes and things like that. All of that stuff, if you want to do that, comes with trade-offs. And the trade-offs are that you end up getting rid of more pro-growth policy, like cutting the corporate tax rate, like 199A, like the individual tax rates and things like that. And I think the focus should be on making it the most pro-growth package that we possibly can, dealing with the spending and things like that elsewhere. There are a number of other inflection points, a debt ceiling, a probe. So obviously, entitlements are the major driver of our deficits in debt. Anyway, when it comes to tax and reconciliation, the focus should be the most pro-growth package we can possibly enact, and then whatever can fit in the reconciliation package and get through, the Byrd rule requirement in the Senate from a policy change standpoint on things like energy, federal workforce, regulation, administrative state, things like that. We should be trying to push in there as well.
So, Dominic, you and I are looking forward to seeing J.D. Vance, go around talking about cutting the corporate income tax, right? Because he's part of those populists who actually is claimed that he wanted to see the corporate income tax go up. So that's a small victory for us on that front.
Oh, for sure. I think the only debate that's happening among conservatives in general and among Republicans in Congress right now is how do we keep taxes low and how much further do we want to cut them? There is no one in Congress on the Republican side right now that's looking for a way to raise taxes. It doesn't exist. And so I think the extent to which people in the past have talked about this, you have groups like American Compass, for example, that have said, tax cuts are yesterday's news, and Republicans are moving on from them. There's no evidence of this out there. Trump ran very blatantly on tax cuts throughout the campaign, and he will be looking to do that going forward. I think cutting the corporate rate is the right move. The 2017 tax reform was a really, really great start on this. We took our corporate rate from being one of the highest ones in the developed world to being roughly the average in the developed world. But I don't see why we should settle for being average. I think we should try to go lower.
And China has a higher rate than we do when you add the average state corporate income tax.
Yes, I was just going to say, when you average, the federal rate is 21% right now, but when you add the average state corporate tax, it goes up to 25.8%. And so that would put us above average. The average is around 20 in most developed countries. And that is the result of a long-term decline, right? Corporate tax rates across the board around the world have been gradually declining for roughly the last 30 years. And that's because governments realize, one, corporate tax is not a good, stable revenue source. It fluctuates very wildly and in ways that are often counterproductive to economic policy. And they realize that for that very unstable, not very high amount of revenue, there's a really big economic cost in investment and in the labor market, because employees pay part of the corporate tax and consumers pay part of the corporate tax too in higher prices. And so the sort of fiction that this is only a tax on the evil rich people, it doesn't bear out in reality. And more governments around the world have been realizing this, and that's why I think we've seen that long run decline. And again, that's in countries that are much more progressive than the United States is on average. That's in countries that have left-wing parties in government. But they all realize that the corporate tax is an especially destructive form of taxation that we should really try to minimize to the extent that we can.
There's a difference with what we've seen in the part when here talking about taxes and tax cuts, in that it seems to me, at least on the House side, that these guys, they don't want to do extension of taxes without offsets. I mean, and Akash, you've talked about trade-offs, and obviously I think that there is a contingent in the House that is very concerned about making sure we don't blow the deficit any more than it is. And my concern has been, when it comes to the corporate income tax, is that there's been noises from Senator Josh Hawley and J.D. Vance at the time, and even Chip Roy on the House side have actually said, well, maybe we could pay for it. We could pay that stuff with the corporate income tax. Now they're a minority, but that concerns me because, as you said, the corporate income tax is by far the most distortive way to raise revenue. Do you think that if we're talking about offsets, there is an appetite on the House side to look at spending cuts, Akash? What do you hear?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. And what I was going to say is there an appetite for a corporate tax increase? Absolutely, unequivocally, no. There is not from House Republicans, there's not from Senate Republicans, there certainly is not from Donald Trump. And so I think that concern maybe can't be completely discarded, but I think generally we should not be too worried about that. Now, I think to the extent that there are people who, again, are well-intentioned and wanting this thing to be paid for, ultimately that significantly inhibits what we would be able to do on the tax side. And ultimately, I don't think that's a demand that a lot of Republicans are going to hold themselves to as far as the deficit impact. If you remember last time around, I believe it was Senators Toomey and Corker, they basically kind of reached an agreement and they said, okay, we're going to work within the confines of $1.5 trillion costs and see what we can do here. Now, that being said, to your point, Vera, I think they absolutely should be looking for whatever pay-fors they can that are good policy. And I think there's hundreds of billions of dollars there with which they can play around, right? The credits from the Inflation Reduction Act, which I believe are pushing, that bill pushed near $1 trillion in cost now. There's hundreds of billions of dollars of green energy cronyism from that bill that can be rolled back. Student debt relief from the Biden administration that can be rolled back. There's healthcare reforms, site neutral payments and things like that that can get pretty complicated that are, again, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so, again, even some of the federal workforce stuff that Dominic talked about, I mean, those are in the tens of billions of dollars. And so there's quite a bit on the table there as far as paying for these things that are also good policy. I just don't know that it's a good idea to say that, look, if the package isn't 100% paid for, then we're not going to be for it. I think that significantly inhibits what we could do from a pro-growth tax policy standpoint and ultimately would be to the detriment of...
Oh, I totally agree with you, especially if we actually consider that making some of these tax cuts permanent. I mean, for instance, tax credits, to me, they're not pro-growth. And I wouldn't mind getting rid of them and actually getting more lower marginal tax rates or more corporate income tax. But to the extent that we're going to be, making the case that making a lot of these pro-growth policy permanent, and that is going to actually really have an impact on the economy, we have to not ask for 100% offsets, because in theory, that means that the growth we'll get from it will pay some. They won't pay all of it for itself, but some of it certainly. And so this is why I'm not in the camp of offsetting the whole thing. But I think we should use this eagerness to offset to actually push some of the things that we should be doing anyway, right? So we don't have much time, and there's so much we could talk about. We could talk really in details about trade, and I'm just super curious about what you think we're going to get from having all these kind of like tech guys around Trump. If this is a good thing, I mean, it seems that it could be a good thing, but who knows? I want to ask you a last question about crypto. It was kind of stunning. I was getting texts all the time: stand by crypto, stand with crypto. Who do you think, which candidate supports crypto? And it's been kind of President Trump has actually made comments about this. So what's going to happen on that front, if to your knowledge, if anything?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of insight there. Again, it's one where I think instinctually it seems like he's probably in the right place, and this is an issue where I am hopeful, cautiously optimistic again that he has the right kind of people around him who are going to advocate more of a hands-off approach. And again, I think there's probably a political nexus there, right? There was a lot of talk about his appeal to younger men who kind of came out to vote for him and presumably made a big difference. We'll see what the exit polls look like, and to the extent that crypto is politically salient for populations that helped get Trump over the hump this time around. I think it would behoove them to take a smart approach to it, which is kind of the place that a lot of us are at.
Dominic, do you have anything to add?
I think two of the best things that are going to happen because of Trump's win from the federal bureaucracy standpoint is that Gary Gensler at the SEC and Lena Khan at the FTC will no longer be employed by the government. And so I think that's terrific. And as far as crypto is concerned, replacing Gensler with just about anybody else, but certainly replacing him with a good SEC chairman will be great. And as far as what you were talking about with these tech executives that seem to be in Trump's circle and in JD Vance's circle, more so because that is part of his professional background in San Francisco. I'm cautiously optimistic about this. I don't necessarily trust a lot of these people from ideological point of view because I don't think a lot of them have very strong ideological convictions. But they should at the very least understand that the conditions that have allowed the tech industry in the United States to flourish are conditions of small government, of limited involvement from the government. And there are all sorts of regulations and labor market policies that they don't have to deal with in the tech industry simply because they don't have to build physical things. It's not a coincidence that our most valuable, our most successful industry in the United States, the one that crushes the rest of the world, hands down, is an industry that is very reliant on human capital and an industry that is reliant on digital services and not on physical manufacturing. And there are all sorts of tax penalties that physical companies that work in physical space have to pay that tech companies don't. And we have the successful industry that our policy allows for. Congress did not set out to design a good tech industry. We got one sort of by accident from a policy point of view, simply because that's where innovation is allowed to happen. That's where investment is allowed to happen. And if the tech executives can learn from their experience and say, what if we made other industries face similar low regulatory burdens, similar low barriers to entry that we have in our industry? If they can apply that same logic to other industries, I think that will allow those industries to flourish like we've seen the tech industry flourish. And we have really the control experiment of this because in our peer economy in the European Union, our peer economy that's a democracy. They have no tech industry to speak of because they've regulated it out of existence. And we in the United States have the best in the world because we allow it to happen, not because government set out to create it, but simply because government was, in many cases, just late to get around to regulating a lot of this stuff. And so if we can learn that lesson from tech, apply it to other industries, that would be a really great possible positive outcome of the Trump administration.
Well, thanks, guys. There's tons we could be talking about. So everyone go and follow Dominic and read him at National Review and follow Akash and read him everywhere you can. And guys, I'll see you for the next big political policy debrief. Thank you.
Thanks, Amira.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dominic.